The sky divides Zeus. The hum of jet engines created a constant, soothing backdrop in the economy cabin of Flight 3416. The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, slicing through a crystal-clear sky. Passengers were settling into their routines, headphones on, books open, and eyes closed. The calm, however, was disrupted by a group of men occupying the last 3 rows of the aircraft. Clad in worn leather jackets with various insignias, the bikers had claimed their space with an air of untouchable confidence. Their leader, a man who went by the name Razor, was hard to miss. Built like a linebacker and covered in tattoos that told a story of rebellion, he leaned into the aisle, commanding attention with his booming voice. Each laugh, each crude joke, echoed through the cabin, leaving an air of discomfort among the passengers. Razor's crew matched his demeanor, gruff and unapologetic. Flight attendants approached their row cautiously, forced smiles barely masking their unease. "Another round," Razor shouted, waving his empty soda cup at a passing flight attendant. She hesitated for a split second before stepping closer to take the cup, her forced grin tightening as she retreated toward the galley. The bikers erupted in laughter, basking in their ability to dominate the small space. 2 rows ahead, a man sat alone, his presence almost invisible amidst the chaos. Dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and slacks, with a tablet resting on the tray table in front of him, Marcus Lane projected an air of quiet composure. His hand moved rhythmically as he scrolled through his screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. If the bikers noticed him, they didn't yet care. Marcus didn't seem like the type to provoke their interest, just another faceless passenger, lost in his own world. The plane jolted as a ripple of turbulence rocked through the cabin. Passengers instinctively tightened their seatbelts, while Razor and his crew whooped like they were on a roller coaster. Marcus calmly secured his tablet, his eyes flicking toward the window as he studied the distant horizon. Another jolt shook the cabin, this one sharper, drawing a collective gasp from the passengers. "Relax, people," Razor barked, his laughter breaking the tension. "This plane's tougher than it looks." As the turbulence subsided, Marcus leaned back in his seat, seemingly unbothered. His calm was almost unnerving. He closed his tablet and reached for a notebook from the seat pocket. As he flipped it open, Razor's voice boomed again. "Hey, Mr. Serious up there," Razor called, his tone mocking. "You too busy for some fun?" Marcus didn't look back. He merely turned another page. "Guess we got a mute on board," Razor sneered. "Maybe he thinks he's too good for us, huh?" This drew snickers from the rest of the gang. The cabin grew quieter, passengers hesitant to engage or draw attention to themselves. Razor thrived on the silence, feeding off the power it gave him. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered across his face. The turbulence returned, this time more violently, as the plane bucked and shook. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few bags fell loose. Razor's bravado faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, masking his unease with another loud laugh. The voice of the lead flight attendant broke through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats and remain seated until the sign is turned off." Passengers obeyed, bracing themselves as the plane rocked again. Razor glanced toward the front of the aircraft, his expression darkening. "What's going on up there?" he muttered. The cabin lights flickered briefly, adding to the growing sense of unease. Marcus, however, remained unflustered. He carefully closed his notebook and slid it into the pocket of his seat. Then, to the surprise of everyone around him, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Heads turned as he made his way down the aisle, his movements steady despite the shaking plane. Razor and his gang watched him, their earlier mockery replaced by curiosity. Razor leaned into the aisle as Marcus passed. "Where you think you're going, big shot?" Razor taunted, but Marcus didn't respond. He continued his measured steps toward the cockpit. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Razor's amusement gave way to annoyance, his pride pricked by being ignored. "Hey, I'm talking to you," He barked, but Marcus didn't so much as glance back. When Marcus reached the cockpit door, it opened immediately, and he slipped inside without hesitation. The murmurs turned into gasps of surprise. Razor, caught off guard, stared after him, his bravado cracking. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. The flight attendant from earlier appeared by Razor's row, her professional demeanor now carrying a hint of satisfaction. "That," she said, her voice firm, "is your senior pilot, Captain Lane." For the first time on the flight, Razor was speechless. The calm before the storm. The cabin of Flight 3416 had fallen into an uneasy silence after Marcus entered the cockpit. The bikers, once dominant in their bluster, were subdued, exchanging nervous glances as passengers whispered amongst themselves. Razor, the self-proclaimed leader, slumped back in his seat, his face a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "Captain," he muttered under his breath, still processing the revelation. "That guy. No way." His crew shared his skepticism, but none of them dared to voice it. The turbulence, though intermittent, had begun to fray even their nerves. Each jolt of the plane chipped away at their confidence, leaving them fidgeting in their seats. One of Razor's men, a wiry young biker with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, tapped Razor's arm. "Boss, you think this guy knows what he's doing?" the younger man asked, his voice low enough that the nearby passengers couldn't hear. Razor glared at him, but there was no conviction behind his look. "He better," Razor growled, more to himself than anyone else. At the front of the plane, the cockpit door remained firmly shut. Inside, Marcus and the flight crew worked with mechanical precision. The captain, Rivera, a seasoned aviator with decades of experience, was focused on the plane's controls while Marcus monitored the instrument panel, his expression calm but focused. "We're entering a volatile system," Rivera said, his voice steady. "Winds are picking up, and the radar shows significant activity ahead." Marcus nodded. "Agreed. Let's adjust our altitude. Drop by 2,000 feet and level off. I'll manage the navigation override." Rivera glanced at Marcus, his respect for the younger pilot evident in his tone. "You sure you're up for this, Lane? It's going to get rough." Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. "I've flown rougher. Let's focus on getting these people home." Outside the cockpit, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted further. The bikers, once the loudest voices on the plane, had become unusually quiet. Razor's bravado was slipping, and the others were beginning to notice. "Boss," Snake Tattoo said again, his voice tinged with genuine concern, "maybe we should chill. Let the guy do his job." Razor snapped his gaze to him, his ego flaring despite his growing unease. "You think I'm scared of a little turbulence?" He leaned back in his seat, forcing a smirk. "That guy's probably just pushing buttons and hoping for the best." Before Snake could respond, the plane shuddered violently, causing gasps and muffled cries from the passengers. Razor's smirk vanished as his hands gripped the armrests. The fastened seat belt sign flickered, and a new announcement came over the intercom. "This is Captain Rivera," the voice said, calm but firm. "We're encountering a significant weather system. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Rest assured, your safety is our top priority." The words were meant to reassure, but the tone carried a gravity that wasn't lost on anyone. Razor's crew exchanged uneasy glances. Nearby passengers, sensing their vulnerability, began to speak up. "You don't look so tough now," a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse remarked, glaring at Razor. "Big men with big mouths, but when things get serious, you're just like the rest of us." Razor shot her a look, but he didn't respond. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. The woman's words had landed with precision, hitting the core of his ego. Razor had built his identity on being unshakable, but now, at 35,000 feet with nothing under his control, he felt exposed. The bikers weren't the only ones on edge. A child in the row ahead of them began to cry softly, clutching his stuffed animal as his mother tried to console them. Across the aisle, An elderly man adjusted his oxygen mask, his hands trembling slightly. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a collective unease that bound everyone together, despite their differences. In the cockpit, Marcus and Rivera worked in near silence, their focus unbroken. The radar screen displayed a swirling mass of storm clouds ahead, the turbulence growing stronger with each passing minute. Marcus adjusted the controls with precision, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. "I've rerouted the flight path," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We'll skirt the edge of the system. It'll take us longer, but it's safer." Rivera nodded. "Good call. Let's keep them steady." Back in the cabin, Razor was struggling to maintain his facade. The turbulence had worsened, and even his loyal crew was beginning to show cracks in their bravado. Snake Tattoo clutched his armrest, his knuckles white, while another biker muttered a string of expletives under his breath. "Boss," Snake said again, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should." "Shut up," Razor snapped, his voice louder than intended. Heads turned in their direction, passengers no longer intimidated but openly watching, their expressions a mix of irritation and disbelief. "You think you're the only one scared?" the woman in the floral blouse asked, her tone sharp. "We're all in this together. Stop acting like you own the place." Razor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His confidence was unraveling, and everyone could see it. His crew, once fiercely loyal, now seemed more concerned with their own fears than following his lead. Another jolt of turbulence sent the plane dipping sharply, drawing gasps and cries from the passengers. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, and the flight attendants moved quickly to assist those who needed help. "This is your co-pilot, Marcus Lane," came a calm, measured voice over the intercom. "We've encountered a sudden weather change, but I want to assure you that we are taking every precaution to ensure a safe journey. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and masks secured. Thank you for your cooperation." The voice had an immediate effect on the cabin. The panic subsided, replaced by a cautious sense of reassurance. Even Razor couldn't deny the authority in Marcus's tone. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. The turbulence continued, but the passengers began to rally. A retired nurse seated near the bikers offered assistance to a mother struggling with her child's mask. A businessman shared his spare water bottle with an elderly woman, and a young woman in yoga attire helped an older man secure his seatbelt. The bikers, once the focal point of the cabin's tension, found themselves sidelined. Razor's crew exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier camaraderie now replaced by doubt. Razor, however, remained stubborn, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. "Boss," Snake Tattoo said quietly, "maybe we should listen to them. That guy in the cockpit, he knows what he's doing." Razor shot him a glare but said nothing. For the first time, he seemed to be at a loss for words. The turbulence had shaken more than the plane. It had shaken the foundation of his identity. As the plane rocked again, Marcus's voice returned over the intercom, calm and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making progress. Please bear with us as we navigate through this system. Your safety is our priority." The cabin settled into an uneasy calm, the passengers drawing strength from Marcus's steady reassurance. Razor slumped back in his seat, his arms crossed, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, and it terrified him. The storm outside was relentless, but inside the plane, a different storm was brewing. A storm of reflection, vulnerability, and the slow unraveling of prejudice. Razor didn't know it yet, but the turbulence wasn't just shaking the plane. It was shaking the very core of who he thought he was. Breaking point. The cabin of Flight 3416 seemed to shrink with every passing moment. The oppressive weight of uncertainty pressed down on everyone aboard, made worse by the howling winds and the persistent rattling of the aircraft. Each bump and jolt from the turbulence felt like a hammer striking the collective nerves of the passengers. For Razor, it was a different kind of storm. He sat rigidly in his seat, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The bravado he had so confidently wielded at the beginning of the flight was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Around him, the bikers, his loyal crew, looked equally shaken. Snake Tattoo had pulled his leather jacket off, revealing a plain t-shirt beneath, his tough guy veneer cracking with every shudder of the plane. The others fidgeted, their gazes darting around the cabin, as if searching for reassurance in the faces of strangers. Razor hated it, hated the feeling of losing control. Hated how his men, once so boisterous and fearless, now looked to him for answers he didn't have. He hated that voice from the cockpit, the calm, measured tone of Marcus Lane, who seemed unfazed by the chaos around them. "Who does he think he is?" Razor muttered under his breath, though the accusation was more for himself than anyone else. Snake, seated next to him, glanced over cautiously. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Don't," Razor snapped, cutting him off. "I don't need your advice." The younger man flinched but said nothing more. Razor's grip on his armrest tightened as the plane dipped again, eliciting gasps from passengers and a sharp cry from a toddler a few rows ahead. Razor's eyes darted around the cabin. He saw the elderly couple in matching sweaters clutching each other's hands, the flight attendants working tirelessly to calm passengers, and the young woman across the aisle praying silently. He wanted to say something, anything, that would restore his crew's confidence, but the words wouldn't come. How could they? He didn't believe them himself. The plane jolted violently again, this time accompanied by a metallic groan that sent a ripple of fear through the passengers. Razor's heart raced as the oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling swayed like pendulums. His mouth went dry, his mind flashing to every flight disaster story he ever heard. And then, once more, the intercom crackled. "This is Marcus Lane, your co-pilot. We've encountered some unexpected turbulence, but I want to assure you that this aircraft is designed to handle conditions like these. We are making adjustments to our flight path to ensure a safe journey. Please remain seated, keep your seat belts fastened, and take deep breaths. We appreciate your patience." The voice was calm, almost unnaturally so, and it grated on Razor's nerves. How could anyone sound so composed? Did Marcus even understand the danger they were in? Or was he just pretending, playing the part of the unflappable hero? Razor's mind churned with anger and fear, the two emotions feeding off each other. He clenched his fists and looked at Snake, who was gripping his armrest so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Why's everyone acting like he's some kind of saint? Razor growled. He's just a guy who got lucky enough to wear a uniform. Snake hesitated before replying. Maybe he's more than that, boss. I mean, he's the one flying the plane. Razor's glare could have cut steel. Don't start with me, Snake. Before Snake could respond, a voice from across the aisle interrupted. It was the middle-aged man in the military veteran cap who had been quietly observing the bikers since boarding. He leaned slightly toward Razor, his expression firm, but not unkind. "Flying a plane through a storm like this isn't luck," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "It's skill, training, discipline." Razor turned to him, his pride flaring. "And you would know." The man nodded. 30 years in the Air Force. I've seen my share of storms, both in the air and on the ground. And I've seen men like you, big talkers until the heat's on. Razor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The veteran continued, his voice calm but pointed. "That pilot you're mocking, he's keeping us alive right now. You might want to think about that before you open your mouth again." The words landed like a punch to Razor's gut. He wanted to lash out, to defend his pride, but the turbulence cut him off, throwing the plane into another sharp dip that left his stomach in his throat. Across the aisle, the tension had a different effect. The veteran's words seemed to rally the other passengers. A woman in business attire began speaking quietly to the people around her, sharing what she'd read about modern aviation safety. A young man pulled out his phone and started a calming playlist, offering his earbuds to a nervous teenager seated beside him. Even Snake seemed to take comfort in the shifting atmosphere. He looked at Razor again, his expression more resolute this time. "Boss," he said quietly, "we need to calm down. Everyone's trying to pull together. Maybe we should too." Razor didn't respond. He was too busy grappling with a reality he'd spent years avoiding. For as long as he could remember, he had thrived on being in control, on projecting strength and dominance. But now, at 35,000 feet, in the grip of a storm he couldn't fight, he felt small, powerless. The intercom crackled again, pulling him from his thoughts. "This is Captain Rivera," the voice announced. "We've successfully rerouted to a safer flight path. Conditions should improve shortly. Thank you for your cooperation." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, but it was short-lived. Moments later, the plane shuddered violently, accompanied by a loud pop that sent gasps echoing through the cabin. Razor's heart leaped into his throat as the lights flickered, plunging the plane into brief darkness before they stabilized again. The calm voice of Marcus returned, this time carrying an edge of urgency. "We've experienced a minor electrical issue, but backup systems are online. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the flight crew." The passengers obeyed, but the tension was palpable. Razor felt the walls closing in, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked at Snake, whose fear mirrored his own, and then at the veteran, who was now comforting a nervous woman in the row behind him. Razor didn't know what to say or do. He had spent his life being the one others turned to, the one who never backed down. But now, as the storm raged outside and the plane trembled beneath him, he felt like a fraud. For the first time, Razor realized that strength wasn't about how loud you could be or how much you could intimidate others. Strength was quiet. Strength was steady. Strength was sitting in a cockpit, guiding a plane full of strangers through a storm, no matter how terrifying it might be. And Marcus Lane, the man Razor had mocked, was the embodiment of that strength. The edge of trust. The cabin of Flight 3416 had reached a fragile equilibrium. Fear hung thick in the air, but it had morphed into a quiet solidarity among most passengers. Conversations had shifted from anxious whispers to supportive reassurances. Strangers held hands, shared snacks, and exchanged nervous smiles. The turbulence continued, jostling the plane, but the unity growing among the passengers seemed to provide a kind of invisible stability. Except for Razor. Razor sat rigid in his seat, staring ahead as if the storm outside the plane's walls was reflected within him. Around him, his crew had grown uncharacteristically quiet. Snake Tattoo had tucked his arms across his chest, eyes darting nervously toward the window, while another biker, Baz, flipped a lighter open and closed compulsively, the metallic clicks unnerving those nearby. Razor's fists clenched, his pride still wounded from the exchange with the Air Force veteran across the aisle. He stole a glance at the older man, who now seemed to be leading a quiet discussion with the passengers around him, explaining turbulence and aviation safety with the calm authority of someone who had lived through countless storms. Razor hated it, the way people seemed to rally around Marcus Lane, the unseen pilot whose voice over the intercom carried more weight than Razor's entire presence in the cabin. The bikers had been the center of attention, commanding the flight attendants' cautious smiles and the passengers' uneasy stares. Now, they were an afterthought, eclipsed by the growing admiration for Marcus. "Boss," Snake muttered, breaking the silence. "We can't keep acting like this. It's making us look bad." Razor's glare snapped to him, sharp as a whip. "What do you mean, look bad?" He growled, "We're not doing anything." Snake shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, but I don't know, man. That pilot, Marcus, he's keeping us alive. Maybe we should show a little respect." "Respect." Razor barked, his voice louder than he intended. A few heads turned in their direction, but Razor ignored them. For what? For a guy doing his job. Snake opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden lurch of the plane cut him off. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the overhead lights flickered again. Razor instinctively gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. His heart pounded as his bravado wavered, but he forced a sneer onto his face. "See," Razor said, his voice tight. "This guy doesn't have it under control." Enough. The single word was quiet, but it cut through Razor's tirade like a blade. It came from Baz, the oldest of the bikers, whose weathered face was usually adorned with a smirk. Now his expression was hard, his eyes steady as they locked onto Razor's. "Enough of this," Baz said, louder this time. "You're scared, boss. We all are. But you're making it worse for everyone else." Razor blinked, caught off guard. Baz had never spoken to him like that before. The others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Razor's gaze. Snake, however, nodded in agreement. "He's right, boss," Snake said. "You've got to let it go." "Let it go?" Razor snapped, his voice rising. "You want me to sit here and trust some guy I don't even know?" A new voice interrupted, firm and deliberate. "You don't have to know him to trust him." Razor turned to see the Air Force veteran leaning toward him, his face calm but resolute. "That man in the cockpit," the veteran continued, "has trained for years to handle situations like this. He's dedicated his life to keeping people like us safe. You might not like him, but right now, he's the only thing standing between us and disaster." Razor's jaw tightened. "And what makes you so sure he's got it under control?" The veteran smiled faintly. "Because he hasn't panicked. And a good leader doesn't panic." The words hit Razor like a gut punch. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down, he knew the veteran was right. Razor had always prided himself on being a leader, on commanding respect and loyalty. But now, in the face of a true crisis, he saw the difference between himself and someone like Marcus Lane. Before Razor could respond, the intercom crackled again. Marcus's voice, steady and calm, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to make adjustments to navigate around the storm. I want to thank you all for your patience and cooperation. Your support and calmness make all the difference in situations like this. Please remain seated, and we'll keep you updated as we progress." The cabin fell silent as Marcus's words sank in. Razor felt a pang of something unfamiliar, shame. He glanced around the cabin, seeing the way the passengers leaned into each other, drawing strength from Marcus's assurance. Even Snake and Baz looked calmer, their tension easing as they absorbed the pilot's calm demeanor. Razor shifted in his seat, his mind racing. He wanted to hold on to his anger, his pride, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in years, he felt small, not in a way that invited pity, but in a way that forced him to confront the reality of his own limitations. The plane jolted again, this time harder than before. A child's cry pierced the air, and a flight attendant hurried down the aisle to offer comfort. Razor's heart pounded as he gripped the armrests, his earlier confidence completely gone. And then something unexpected happened. The woman in the floral blouse, the same one who had confronted Razor earlier, leaned toward him. Her expression was softer now, her voice quieter. "We're all scared," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But that doesn't mean we can't be better. It doesn't mean we can't trust the people who know what they're doing." Razor stared at her, his throat tight. He wanted to dismiss her words, to brush them off as meaningless platitudes. But he couldn't. Not this time. The plane dipped again, and Razor instinctively reached out to steady himself. To his surprise, the woman offered her hand. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it. It wasn't much, just a small gesture. But in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. As the turbulence continued, Razor sat back in his seat, his grip on the woman's hand steady. Around him, the cabin had begun to transform. Passengers were leaning on each other, offering support in ways big and small. Even Snake and Baz had joined in, helping a flight attendant distribute water bottles to those who needed them. And for the first time in a long time, Razor didn't feel like he had to be the one in control. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to trust that someone else did. The storm within. The turbulence outside was relentless. Lightning flickered through the windows, illuminating the dark clouds that surrounded Flight 3416. The passengers clung to their seats as the plane trembled under the strain of the storm. Yet, despite the chaos, a strange calm had begun to settle inside the cabin. Marcus Lane's steady updates from the cockpit were like a lifeline, each word carefully chosen to instill confidence. Passengers whispered reassurances to one another, their unity a stark contrast to the fear that had dominated the earlier part of the flight. Even Razor was beginning to feel the shift. For years, Razor had been the leader of his group, the one everyone looked to for strength and direction. His identity was built on dominance, on being the loudest, the toughest, the most unshakable. But now, sitting in a plane battered by winds and turbulence, Razor felt that identity unraveling. He glanced at Snake Tattoo, who was sitting with his head down, hands clasped tightly around his seatbelt. Next to him, Baz had abandoned his lighter and was quietly talking to a flight attendant, offering to help distribute water bottles to passengers who looked pale or distressed. The sight of his crew, the men who had followed him unquestioningly for years, now finding solace in cooperation, stung Razor's pride. "Boss," Snake said quietly, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. "You okay?" Razor didn't answer right away. He wasn't okay. He hadn't been okay since the turbulence started. But admitting that felt impossible. Instead, he forced a shrug. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Snake gave him a searching look, then nodded. "Good. 'Cause, we're lucky to have someone like that pilot up there. Keeps saying the right things, keeps the plane steady. I was thinking." He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "Maybe we were wrong about him." Razor stiffened. "Wrong? About what?" Snake shifted in his seat, avoiding Razor's gaze. "About judging him. Thinking he wasn't cut out for the job just 'cause he's not what we expected." The words hit Razor harder than he cared to admit. He wanted to dismiss them, to argue that they hadn't been wrong, but he couldn't find the words. Because deep down, he knew Snake was right. They had judged Marcus from the moment they saw him. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, it had seemed weak to Razor, the opposite of what a leader should be. But now, as the plane battled the storm and Marcus's voice continued to soothe and guide them, Razor couldn't deny the truth. Marcus was a leader, a better one than Razor had ever been. Across the aisle, the Air Force veteran caught Razor's eye. The man nodded, as if he could see the struggle Razor was wrestling with. Razor quickly looked away, his face burning. The intercom crackled, and Marcus's voice filled the cabin once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've cleared the worst of the storm and are now on a more stable flight path. We'll be entering calmer airspace shortly. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. Some passengers clapped softly. Others leaned back in their seats, their tension visibly easing. Razor felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly, but it wasn't just because of Marcus's announcement. It was because of the way the passengers had come together, turning fear into connection, chaos into calm. The woman in the floral blouse, who had earlier scolded Razor, leaned toward him again. This time, her expression was softer. "See," she said, "we're going to be fine, and you might want to think about thanking that pilot when we land." Razor opened his mouth to snap back, but the words died on his lips. Instead, he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. The woman smiled faintly and leaned back in her seat. Razor's thoughts churned as the minutes passed. He looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers. The mother cradling her crying child. The elderly couple holding hands. Snake, now quietly reassuring a nervous teenage girl in the row behind them. You think he's always this calm? Snake asked, breaking the silence. Razor turned to him, unsure of how to answer. Who? Lane, Snake said, gesturing toward the cockpit. Think he ever loses it, or do you think he's just like that? Razor shrugged, though he couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Marcus Lane's voice had been a constant presence throughout the flight, calm and steady even as the plane fought through the storm. It was a kind of strength Razor had never experienced, the kind that didn't need to prove itself because it simply was. Before Razor could reply, Baz slid into the seat across the aisle, his leather jacket draped over his arm. He looked at Razor with a mixture of respect and exasperation. Boss, Baz said, his tone firm but not unkind, you need to get over yourself. Razor's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me. Baz leaned forward, his voice low enough that only Razor and Snake could hear. Look around. Everyone on this plane is scared out of their minds, but they're dealing with it. They're helping each other. Even you're starting to come around. But you're still hanging on to this idea that you've got something to prove. Razor opened his mouth to argue, but Baz held up a hand. I'm not saying you're weak, Baz continued. I've ridden with you for years, boss. I know you're tough, but maybe toughness isn't what we need right now. Maybe we need something else. Snake nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between Baz and Razor. He's right, boss. That pilot, he's showing us what it looks like to stay cool when everything's falling apart. Maybe it's time we started paying attention. Razor let their words hang in the air, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He wanted to push back, to assert his authority, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the realization that Baz and Snake weren't challenging him. They were trying to help him. Or maybe it was the simple truth that they were right. The intercom crackled again, and Marcus's voice returned, softer now, but still steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we're officially out of the storm. We'll be cruising through calmer skies for the remainder of the flight. On behalf of Captain Rivera and the crew, thank you for your patience and cooperation. The cabin erupted into applause, a wave of relief washing over the passengers. Razor found himself clapping, too, the sound of his hands meeting his crew's in an unspoken acknowledgement of the man who had guided them through the storm. When the applause died down, Razor turned to Baz and Snake. All right, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Maybe I've been an idiot. Baz grinned. Takes a big man to admit that. Razor rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Don't push it. For the rest of the flight, Razor sat quietly, watching as the passengers continued to support each other. The storm might have passed, but its impact lingered, leaving behind a sense of shared humanity that Razor couldn't ignore. As the plane began its descent, the lights of their destination coming into view, Razor made a decision. When they landed, he would find Marcus Lane. And for the first time in years, he would say two words he hadn't spoken in a long time. Thank you. A landing to remember. The plane's descent felt both surreal and grounding. The storm that had defined most of the flight was far behind them, replaced by clear skies that stretched endlessly in every direction. Below, the lights of the airport shimmered like a beacon, drawing closer with each passing second. Inside the cabin, there was a palpable shift in mood, relief mingling with exhaustion, the tension slowly giving way to cautious optimism. Razor sat in his seat, arms resting on the armrests, staring out the window. For once, he wasn't trying to project dominance or control. His earlier bravado had been stripped away, leaving something raw and unfamiliar in its place. Snake and Baz exchanged glances, but didn't say anything. They could sense the change in their leader. And for now, that was enough. This is Captain Rivera, came the voice over the intercom. We've begun our final descent. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, your tray tables are stowed, and your seats are in the upright position. Thank you for flying with us. The announcement brought a flurry of activity as passengers adjusted their seats and flight attendants moved through the aisles for one last check. The mood was lighter now, Soft laughter here, a reassuring pat on the shoulder there. Even the mother with the crying toddler, who had spent most of the flight struggling to comfort her child, now wore a relieved smile as her little one finally drifted off to sleep. Razor couldn't help but notice how the cabin felt different. There was no more fear, no more division. People who had started the journey as strangers were now talking like old friends, sharing snacks and stories, as if they'd been through a shared battle. And in a way they had. The wheels touched down with a soft bump, and a wave of applause swept through the cabin. Razor clapped along, this time without hesitation. It wasn't just for the safe landing. It was for the crew, for Marcus Lane, and for everyone who had stepped up during the storm. As the plane taxied to the gate, Razor felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He had made up his mind to find Marcus and thank him. But now that the moment was approaching, he wasn't sure what to say. Apologies weren't exactly his strong suit. "You're thinking too much about it," Baz said, leaning over from the aisle seat. Razor turned to him, surprised. "What?" Baz grinned. "Whatever you're gonna say to the guy, just keep it simple. You don't need a speech, just be honest." Razor sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Honest, huh? That's not exactly my thing." "Maybe it's time it was," Snake added, a rare smirk crossing his face. The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began standing, stretching, and gathering their belongings. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, thanking people and directing them toward the exit. Razor stayed seated, letting the others file out first. Baz and Snake waited with him, sensing that their leader wasn't ready to face the crowd just yet. When the last of the passengers had exited, Razor finally stood. The aisle was quiet now, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the engines winding down and the murmured conversations between the crew. Razor hesitated, then motioned for Baz and Snake to follow him. As they stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, Razor caught sight of Marcus Lane standing just beyond the door to the cockpit. He was talking with Captain Rivera and one of the flight attendants, his expression calm and composed, as if the storm they had just endured was nothing more than a routine part of his day. Razor's stomach churned. He felt like a kid about to face a principal's lecture. He motioned for Baz and Snake to hang back, then approached Marcus slowly, his footsteps heavy against the metal floor of the jet bridge. Marcus noticed him and turned, his expression unreadable. Razor stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The biker with his weathered leather and tattoos, and the pilot in his crisp uniform, the epitome of calm professionalism. Razor cleared his throat. Captain Lane." "Co-pilot Lane," Marcus corrected gently. "But yes." Razor nodded, awkwardly stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. "Right. Co-pilot. Look, I wanted to say thanks. For, getting us through that." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "You're welcome. But it wasn't just me. It was the whole crew. We're trained for situations like that." "I know," Razor said quickly. "I mean, I didn't know, but I get it now. And I also wanted to say I'm sorry for, the way I acted earlier, judging you, acting like I knew better. I didn't, and you proved that." Marcus's lips twitched into a small smile. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong." Razor shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, well, I'm not great at it, but you deserve it. You kept it together up there, kept all of us together." Marcus extended his hand, and Razor stared at it for a moment before shaking it. "Thank you for saying that," Marcus said. "It means a lot." As their hands parted, Razor stepped back, glancing at Baz and Snake, who had been watching from a distance. He turned back to Marcus, his voice quieter now. "You're a better leader than I'll ever be. Just thought you should know that." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. "Leadership isn't about being better. It's about bringing out the best in others. And judging by the way your crew's been helping everyone on board, I'd say you're not as far off as you think." Razor blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected that kind of response, and it left him speechless. As Marcus turned to rejoin Captain Rivera and the flight attendants, Razor stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the interaction settle. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. "You good, boss?" Baz asked as Razor walked back to his crew. Razor nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." They left the jet bridge together, stepping into the bustling terminal, their journey through the storm behind them. But Razor knew the real change hadn't happened in the air. It had happened inside him. And for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. Clear skies ahead. As Razor, Baz, and Snake stepped into the terminal, the bright fluorescent lights felt jarring after the dim, storm-laden flight. The hum of conversations and the sight of people moving freely brought a strange sense of normalcy, as if the chaos in the sky had been nothing more than a distant dream. Passengers from Flight 3416 gathered near the baggage claim, their faces alight with relief and gratitude. Razor noticed the young mother cradling her now sleeping child, chatting with the elderly couple who had been seated nearby. The Air Force veteran was laughing with the businesswoman, who had put her phone away for good, apparently satisfied with her mental notes of the event. Razor felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it pride? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he no longer felt like the center of attention, and for once, he didn't mind. Baz nudged him with an elbow. "Look over there." Razor followed Baz's gaze and spotted Marcus Lane again, this time standing near a group of flight attendants. Passengers were approaching him one by one, shaking his hand, thanking him. Marcus's calm smile never wavered, his demeanor still as steady as it had been in the cockpit. Snake leaned in. "Think he ever gets tired of it?" "Nah," Razor said after a moment. "That guy, he's built for this." They moved toward the carousel, waiting for their bags. As Razor reached for his worn leather duffel, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Hey, Razor." He turned to see the woman in the floral blouse standing nearby, her hands on her hips, and a knowing look on her face. Razor braced himself for another lecture, but to his surprise, she smiled. "You know, you're not half as bad as I thought you were," she said. "I saw how your guys helped out back there. You might want to think about doing more of that." Razor chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, maybe we've been looking at things the wrong way. Doesn't hurt to help, I guess." Her smile widened, and she nodded. "It doesn't. Safe travels." As she walked away, Razor felt Baz's hand clap his shoulder. "Boss, I think you've got a fan." "Shut up," Razor muttered, though a faint grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. The ride home. The trio exited the terminal into the crisp night air, where their bikes were parked in a designated lot. The storm had moved on, leaving the city washed clean under a clear, star-filled sky. The roar of engines from other vehicles felt grounding, a reminder that life had gone on while they'd been in the air. As Razor swung a leg over his bike, Baz spoke up. "So, boss, what's next? Back to the usual?" Razor paused, his hand resting on the handlebars. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what the usual even meant anymore. He thought about the flight, about Marcus Lane's steady voice, the unity among the passengers, and the quiet strength he'd seen in his own crew. "Maybe not," Razor said finally. He looked at Baz and Snake, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Maybe it's time we started thinking bigger than ourselves." Baz raised an eyebrow. "Bigger, huh? What's that look like?" Razor smirked, firing up his engine. "Guess we'll figure it out." Snake grinned, his own engine roaring to life. "Sounds like a plan, boss." As the three of them rode out of the parking lot and onto the open road, Razor felt lighter than he had in years. The storm was behind them now, not just the one in the sky, but the one inside him, the one he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt wide open. and Razor was ready for the journey.